Hi, everyone. Welcome to Kiwi College. I'm Sarah Smith. I'm the editorial director of Kiwi, and I'm so happy you could all join us today because we have a very special speaker. Robin O'Brien is the founder of the Allergy Kids Foundation, an organization designed to help protect the 1 in 3 American children that now has autism, ADHD, asthma, or allergies derived from the chemicals so pervasive in our food supply. She's a mom of 4 and the author of The Unhealthy Truth. She's also a renowned speaker around the country, and we're very lucky to have her here today. I'd like to thank our sponsor, especially for that, Stonyfield Organic. In addition to Stonyfield's popular adult yogurts, including organic Oikos Greek yogurt, they have a full line of Yo Baby, Yo Toddler, and Yo Kids yogurts for little ones of every age. Their Yo Baby family of yogurts are 100% organic and specially crafted for babies as early as 6 months. And yogurt is a pediatrician-recommended first food for babies, and the entire Yo Baby line is made without the use of synthetic growth hormones, antibiotics, or persistent pesticides, and contains no artificial colors or flavors. So thank you, Stonyfield. I want everyone to know that after Robin talks, she's going to take questions. So please feel free to type them in at any time during her presentation and after, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So with that, welcome, Robin. Thank you so much for being here, and please take it away.
Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us this morning. It is an incredible time for the health of our families, and all of you guys that are on the front line are doing such amazing work. So it is an honor to spend this time with you this morning, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your summer days. So as we get started, I would just like to begin by saying, you know, I don't know about the rest of you, but I am such an unlikely person to be doing this. I was born and raised in Houston, Texas, and, you know, we ate meat and potatoes for dinner, but we also had our fair share of Doritos and Ding Dongs. I wasn't a foodie. I just simply thought, you know, if stuff was on grocery store shelves, it was safe. And, you know, with a busy schedule, limited time, limited budget, the last thing I wanted to hear was anybody telling me what to feed my kids. And, you know, as that kind of rolled into motherhood, you know, prior to having these children, I had been an analyst on Wall Street. We had met the management teams of places like Whole Foods. And, you know, when they talk about all this stuff about organic food, yeah, I just thought it was a marketing niche. I thought, you know, it's super expensive. And obviously, you know, it's either kind of lifestyles of the rich and famous or some hippie thing. And that was about as far as I got. Until one day, the health of one of my children took a turn for the worse, and like so many of us today, I found myself suddenly thrown into these epidemics. And in all candor, it happened one morning over breakfast when I was feeding the kids some pre-made waffles that I put in the toaster, some blue yogurt, and some scrambled eggs. And as our youngest child started to have this allergic reaction and her face started to swell shut, I was so unfamiliar with what that actually looked like that I turned to the older 3 and I said, you know, what did you put in her face? And they all just gave me these blank little kid stares. And at that point, I rushed her to the pediatrician's office. And the doctor said, you know, Robin, what did you feed the kids for breakfast? Because she looks like she's having an allergic reaction. And I was so completely clueless at that point. And she starts rattling off these stats about how 1 out of 17 kids under the age of 3 has a food allergy. There had been a massive increase in the rate of peanut allergy from 1997 until 2002. There had been a doubling. And then I went on to learn later that day that according to the CDC, there had been a 265% increase in the rate of hospitalizations related to food allergic reactions. And so as I was learning all of this, I thought, you know, when we were kids, we didn't see these same statistics. And when we were children and we walked into our lunchrooms, a PB&J and a carton of milk were standard. Those weren't considered loaded weapons on a lunchroom table. And so, you know, it made me step back and it kind of begged the question of what's changed. You know, why are we seeing all of these epidemics in our children today? And because we are seeing this epidemic, you know, whether we're talking about autism or allergies or ADHD or asthma or diabetes or cancers or obesity, what we're realizing is that the landscape of childhood has changed, but that also means that the landscape of motherhood has changed too. And as I began to dig into this data, I realized that our generation of kids were being called Generation RX. And as you can imagine, and I'm sure a lot of you must feel, like that kind of hits you like a bowling ball to the stomach. Because you're looking at these kids and we know that they're sick, we know that they've got all of these conditions and we're doing our best to manage them, but it also begs the question, of what has changed. And as I began to reach out to doctors, I learned that epidemics like these, they don't have genetic triggers, they have environmental ones. And so it really began this incredible journey. And as I began to continue to dig into the research, I was leveraging all of that expertise and insight and the skill set that I had developed as an analyst, digging into the corporate financial statements and things when I was doing that prior to having kids. I learned that 1 in 3 U.S. kids now does have autism, allergies, ADHD, or asthma. And 1 in 3 Caucasian kids and 1 in 2 minority children are expected to be insulin dependent by the time they reach adulthood. But even greater than that, and which was of such cause of concern for me, was that I learned that cancer is the leading cause of death by disease in our children under the age of 15. And I thought, I don't want to sit around and wait for this to happen. I want to know what I can do now to help exercise precaution and take preventative steps to protect the health of my children. And so as I began to look into what exactly has changed, I started in the food allergy world, and I learned that beginning in the 1990s, we began to engineer these new chemicals and these new proteins into our food supply. And because they had never yet been proven safe, a lot of these ingredients were not allowed in foods in other parts of the world. They were not allowed into children's foods in particular, and if they were put into those foods, they were labeled so that moms could make an informed choice. And so as I began to really dig into that, I thought, okay, so if a child with a food allergy sees food proteins as foreign, and her body launches this inflammatory response to drive out that foreign invader, are there foreign proteins in our food supply that weren't there when we were kids? And so when I turned to the U.S. Department of Agriculture to really look at what was going on in our food supply, I learned that yes, in the 1990s, in the middle of the 1990s, so just over 15 years ago, the biotech industry, in order to drive profitability for a lot of the commodity crops that are fed to our cows and fed to our pigs, a lot of the way that dairy is produced in order to help cows make more milk, this new industry, the biotechnology industry, was able to engineer these new proteins into our food supply. And so I turned to leading pediatric allergists and I said, as a kid with a milk allergy, is he allergic to the milk we all drank as kids? Or is he actually allergic to these new synthetic growth hormones and these new proteins that have been introduced and that are now injected into cows to help them make more milk? And this leading allergist, he just said, we don't know. There are no tests. And so I said, so when you're testing my kid for a milk allergy, are you testing him for conventional milk allergy, or is he allergic to organic milk, or is he allergic to this RBGH, which was introduced in 1994? And the guy just looked at me and he said, we don't know. We don't have that kind of testing. There are no allergenicity tests per se. And so as I considered the fact that milk is the #1 allergy in the United States, according to CNN and the Wall Street Journal, I also wanted to know, what other foods have been modified or changed in the last 15 years. And I learned that a few years later, in 1996, in order to enhance profitability for the soy industry, because soy is primarily grown to feed livestock and to fatten cows for our meat supply, that soy was engineered with these new proteins and these new ingredients by the biotech industry to help them withstand increasing doses of weed killers being sprayed in the fields. And so the analyst in me, that made a lot of sense because I thought, this makes sense from a business model perspective. But at the same time, countries around the world said, this has never yet been proven safe. We're not entirely sure we want to be spraying more chemicals onto our crops and continuing to drown these crops in chemicals. And so we're either not going to allow this into our food supply, or if we do, we're going to put a label on it and call it genetically modified so that parents can make an informed choice when it comes to feeding their families. And it was kind of at that point I thought, okay, so we've done this with milk and we've done this with soy. Those are some of the top 8 allergens. I was learning about a number of people that were responding to corn in an allergenic way, so I thought, have we changed our corn? And I learned that a few years later, due to growing concern of the spraying of insecticide over cornfields, because again, corn is primarily used for livestock feed and it's also used for ethanol, scientists were able to take that insecticide and create this insecticidal protein that was then engineered into the DNA of a corn seed so that as a corn plant grows, it can release its own insecticide. And for that reason, those corn plants now today are regulated by the EPA as an insecticide. And so as I considered the fact that our children were seeing these foreign proteins in the food supply and that their bodies were responding in this allergenic inflammatory way, it begged the question, are the children actually allergic to foods, or are they allergic to these new biotechnology, these new agrochemical ingredients that were introduced into the food supply 15 years ago? And so as I began to really look into this, I realized that, not only were we engineering these chemicals into the food, but as a result, the amount of herbicides and weedicides, the sides that were being applied to these food crops, was also increasing. And as those of you might be familiar with the Environmental Working Group, there is an increasing amount of chemicals being applied to our produce today. And studies from the American Academy of Pediatrics to the President's Cancers Panel are suggesting that we try to reduce our family's exposure, particularly children, to a lot of these chemicals because of concerns over links to things like cancer and things like ADHD. And so as I continued to learn about this, I realized that while we had accepted this new operating system in the American food supply, while we were allowing these new ingredients to be engineered into our basic crops, while we were allowing this increased use of all of these weed killers and these toxic chemicals to be applied to our food crops, countries around the world had taken a different approach. And that was really hard to hear, because I learned that while we were saying this hasn't yet been proven dangerous, we'll allow it into our food supply, other countries have said this hasn't yet been proven safe. And so the RBGH that we introduced into our milk in 1994, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and all 27 countries in Europe, they said this has never yet been proven safe. The concern they had at the time of its introduction in 1994 was that it increased mastitis, ovarian cysts, it caused skin disorders in the cows that it was being injected into. And so for that reason, it required an increased antibiotic use in the animals. And so for all of those reasons, for the increased antibiotic use and the disorders it was causing in the animals, they said, we don't want this in our food supply. Studies then came out later that showed that it elevated hormone levels that were linked to breast, prostate, and colon cancer. And so once again, countries around the world said, we don't want this in our food supply. And when I learned that this growth hormone elevated levels of breast, prostate, and colon cancer, I wanted to know, what are the rates of cancer here in the U.S. versus these other countries? And absolutely, correlation is not causation. But when you learn that the U.S. has one of the highest rates of cancer of any country in the world, you realize that 1 in 8 women have breast cancer, and then you go on to learn that only 1 in 10 of those cases are genetic, which means that 9 out of 10 of them are environmentally triggered. You realize that there is actually a lot that we can do to help exercise precaution and protect our families the way families around the world have already been protected. And as I continue to look into this, I realized, there are a lot of our corporations, our American corporations, that they sell the products here, but they're also selling their products in Europe and, Asia and Australia and New Zealand and Japan. And that's when I realized that in order to meet these standards in other countries, our American corporations are formulating their products differently. And so a lot of the additives that we see on this list, like high fructose corn syrup, which, as so many of you would know, has proved highly controversial. The sales of that product are declining. We've got all kinds of ad campaigns spinning around the TV. But it was things like artificial colors and dyes, aspartame, an artificial sweetener, RBGH, that artificial growth hormone, and a lot of these biotechnology, genetically modified proteins that have been introduced in the last 15 years. Those simply aren't included in products that our American corporations are making in other countries. So when I learned that, and I learned about this double standard and how they truly have formulated things differently for eaters in other countries, I got to admit it was kind of depressing at first, because I thought, it feels like we're second-class citizens. I mean, why have they done this for eaters in other countries and not here? And I realized that what had happened was that there was consumer demand, and that ahead of any legislation or any government regulation that might have been imposed, consumers started to learn about this stuff. And they taught each other, and they went to these corporations, and they went to their grocery stores, and they simply said, we expect a better product. And in response, our American corporations, from Kraft, Coca-Cola to Walmart, did an extraordinary job of responding to that consumer demand. And I realized that that could actually be pretty inspiring, and that together, working together, we could all begin to reach out and educate each other and create this same demand here in the United States. And so, as I stepped back, I thought, we've got these artificial colors in our products here. They're not using them in the UK, Australia, and around the world. The primary reason they're not using those artificial colors is because of this incredibly compelling study called the Southampton study that linked those artificial colors to hyperactivity in children. Now, as any mom knows, if you, especially those with little boys, because for some reason it disproportionately hits the boys, if you can do something to help peel those boys off of the ceiling, you bet you're going to try to do that. And so as I was learning about the fact that yellow number 5 and all of these reds and all of these blues and everything that had been in that yogurt that I had fed my kids that morning weren't being used in children's foods in other countries because of their link to hyperactivity, I thought, what can I do to try to dial that back in my family's diet here in the U.S.? And as I really started to look into the data again, I realized that our children, having earned that nickname of Generation RX, it's primarily because of the record number of medications and prescriptions that they're on, everything from allergy medicines to ADHD medicines to medicines that help them manage their diabetes. And as study after study continues to show that the U.S. spends more on health care than any other country in the world, I suddenly felt really patriotic about this work because I realized that our global competitiveness might be at stake, and that if we can do a better job of protecting the health of our children, we'll spend less money in this healthcare system, which then lets us put that money towards things like children's education. It lets our corporations be more profitable and more competitive in the global marketplace. And so to me, it truly became an incredible act of patriotism to protect the health of our children. And so as I stepped back from that, I thought, these corporations, their responsibility is to their shareholders. And yet at the same time, when you have companies like Starbucks that are spending more money on healthcare than they are on coffee, then they're worried about it too. And I realized that as a national family sitting down to our national dinner table, all of us together had this incredible opportunity to create this change. And we could take these baby steps, we could start to make changes in our own homes, in our own families, in our own companies, and that could ultimately drive a lot of change in the health of our country. And so, a lot of people say, where do you start? It's so overwhelming, and it truly was. I mean, there was a morning where I opened the kitchen cupboards and I looked in there and I thought, there are all of these ingredients that I can't pronounce that I'm suddenly learning aren't in children's foods in any other part of the world. In these developed countries, and I thought, what can I do to make these changes? And so because children consume so much dairy, my boys guzzled milk like an SUV guzzles gas, I thought, I'm going to start there. I want to get this artificial growth hormone out of my kids' diet. I didn't like the fact that 27 countries in Europe, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan had never allowed it in the first place due to these health concerns, due to the increased antibiotic use. It scared me around the cancer concerns, and I thought, no, I'm not going to gamble on this. I'm not going to take this risk. And so for us, we started in the dairy case. And we stood there that day, and I was looking for milk that was labeled either RBGH-free or organic milk. And I realized that that was an investment in the health of my children and in their future. And so that was the very first thing that we did. I came back to the kitchen and I was looking at all the blue yogurt, all of the fluorescent mac and cheese, and I thought, I don't even know where to start. The kids, there would be mutiny at the kitchen table if I tried to do everything all at once, and we can't afford to anyway, so what am I going to do? And so truly that next step was that fluorescent mac and cheese that I was feeding my kids and buying in crates. I realized, instead of using the entire packet of fluorescent orange powder, we could use half the packet of fluorescent orange powder. And we slowly, in those baby step ways, began to wean the kids off of these chemicals and these artificial colors and these artificial growth hormones that are found in the U.S. food supply that aren't in children's foods in other parts of the world. And so slowly we weaned them off of that fluorescent orange mac and cheese until this miraculous day when the kids actually ate noodles that were the color of noodles. And so as we kept taking these steps, there were amazing resources that you can use. And there are different, like I've mentioned, the Environmental Working Group has this list of Dirty Dozen, and it shows you the top produce and how contaminated they are by the pesticides. And if your kids eat a lot of strawberries, then that might be the one thing, the baby step you may want to take first. Or if your kids are big apple eaters, that might be the one thing or the baby step you want to take first. But then what I also learned was what this USDA organic symbol actually meant. Because in all honesty, up until this point, I've sort of looked at it as this lifestyle, the rich and famous symbol, almost like a status symbol that was on food. And I felt guilty. I didn't want to hear about it. I thought, you know, I can't afford this. My husband doesn't want to support more for the grocery bill. And I truly was uncomfortable when I was confronted with that symbol. But what I learned is that that symbol actually represents a legal standard in food production. And that it means that these foods have been produced without the use of artificial colors, without the use of artificial dyes, without the use of artificial flavorings, artificial growth hormones, chemical food additives, these genetically modified biotech ingredients, these agrochemicals that were only introduced 15 years ago, and that these foods are produced without toxic, persistent pesticides and chemical fertilizers. And as I stopped and I thought, that symbol represents a legal standard and promise to the integrity of that food product. And that the farmers and the food producers who are producing their food according to that USDA organic legal standard have committed to an audit trail every step of the way to ensure that that food product does not contain these toxic ingredients. And suddenly, instead of seeing it as this lifestyle, the rich and famous thing, I saw, you know, this is this incredible symbol that represents an investment in health and a way for me to avoid this toxic exposure for the health of my kids. And so as I began to really wrap my head around USDA organic, I have to admit I got really frustrated with the fact that the price of these foods was much higher than conventional foods. And that's when I learned that as a national family sitting down to our national dinner table, our national budget, which we all pay into as taxpayers, is used to grow these crops that are produced with all these chemicals, with all these biotech ingredients engineered into them, these crops that are now regulated as insecticides. That's how our national family budget is used. And then over on the other side, the farmers that are growing things organically, which means without the use of all of these ingredients on this list, the farmers that are growing things organically are then charged fees to prove that their stuff is safe. They're then charged fees to label it, and they don't get the same marketing assistance and crop insurance programs as the conventional farmers do. And I thought, you know, as a national family, is this really how we want to be spending our national budget? And so, you know, as I stepped back from that, I thought, you know, we have this incredible ability to educate each other. We have these amazing companies that are really doing their best to bring these products to market. Companies like Stonyfield, who for 28 years have been committed to not only putting the most authentic, clean, and safe ingredients into that yogurt pot so that when you're purchasing it off of the grocery store shelves, you know exactly what you're getting and what that represents, and you know that everything in that pot has been accounted for and that all of those toxic ingredients were never even part of the process. And then you also, what's interesting is that with the leadership of companies like Stonyfield and with the leadership of companies like Annie's and Honest Kids and others that you see in the grocery store, Safeway, Kroger, Costco, Walmart, they're all starting to follow. And they're doing it in response to consumer demand. And while none of us can do everything, nobody can afford to go all organic all the time, all of us can do something. And that we are a nation of 300 million eaters, and that as we collectively begin to change our shopping habits, not only are these corporations listening, but they are responding. And so it's so important to realize that you don't have to make the perfect the enemy of the good, that this is about progress, not perfection. My kitchen was absolutely loaded with all of these things. We went from using the whole pack of fluorescent orange powder to half the pack. You know, the first step I took was to try to buy organic milk, and everything else in the kitchen was still loaded. But I realized that in taking those baby steps, it felt so good to be able to create that change. And it was in a way that we could adjust as a family. We could make these small incremental changes in our grocery budget in order to be able to invest in this healthier food. And I realized, you know, again, you cannot make the perfect the enemy of the good. And so for us, we developed what I call the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the time we did the best job we could. The other 20% of the time, you realize that these kids go to birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese, or they're going to be in their classroom and get a cupcake that's loaded with blue icing. And you have to have the flexibility to not make the perfect the enemy of the good, because that is the only way realistically to be able to navigate these changes in the system as it currently exists today. And so as we started to make these changes, I mean, again, my husband is a finance guy, and he was not exactly keen on the fact that we were going to be increasing, our family budget. And so some of the steps that we took in order to be able to afford more organic produce was to eat less meat, and we embraced this idea of Meatless Mondays, which, having grown up in Texas, that was a pretty radical step in all candor initially. I really felt that you had to have meat at every meal. And so to make those changes, it was a pretty big shift in the way that we thought about things. But we realized it was just one day a week, and we could make these changes and incorporate something like, chili or beans and rice instead of meat, and we could begin to afford these organic options. Another thing that we learned was to cook it once, eat it twice. The more that I got into a lot of the arguments that we need this technology to feed the world, I also learned that according to the USDA, the U.S. throws away anywhere between 25 and 50% of the food that we produce. It simply gets tossed before we even eat it. And so I realized, we could probably do a better job, especially with 4 kids, of really cutting back on food waste and getting creative. I didn't know how to cook. We burnt noodles. We burnt pretty much everything in the beginning. It was a huge experiment and learning curve for all of us. But again, it was not about making the perfect the enemy of the good. It was about trying to reduce our family's exposure to these chemicals that aren't used in children's foods in other parts of the world. And so, I had to get creative. I realized that About.com has incredible coupons and cost-saving ideas on their website. Amazon.com and Target.com are great places to go if you're looking for affordable ways to feed your family organic food. And as I came through a lot of this information, I realized that just as I had rolled my eyes at people who had tried to teach me about this early on, that there were probably going to be people that were going to do the same to me. There were people that weren't going to want to hear what I had to say. And I realized that probably the most important thing you can do as you begin to make these changes for the health of your family is to find a friend to do it with. Because people probably will roll their eyes, but you're going to learn that it'll roll right off of you because you feel so good about the changes that you're making for your family. And if you have a friend who can stand beside you and you can share these stories with her or with him, it really does help you move through some of those early stages. One of the other things that is incredibly important, and luckily we have so many great options for this, is to start a book club. There are so many books coming out every day practically that are great cookbooks for those of us that are learning to cook the first time, or those of us that are learning to cook gluten-free, or those of us that have to cook dairy-free for our children. There are also incredible books, whether they are fiction or nonfiction, that really help shed a light on the story. One of the other things that I realized is that it really, as I was looking at this data and the fact that 1 in 3 kids have these 4 A's, allergies, autism, ADHD, or asthma, and then I was learning how 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women are expected to get cancer in their lifetime, and that we had learned that 1 in 3 Caucasian kids and 1 in 2 minority kids were expected to be insulin dependent by the time they reach adulthood. Those are jaw-dropping statistics. But what I realized is that this is affecting all of us. There's not a family in the country that is not being impacted by these chronic diseases. And once I had that understanding, I realized that you could reach out to people with a compassion and a kindness and an understanding for the fact that we are all at this table together. And so as I started to contact local journalists and share this concern, knowing that there would be a reciprocation of that concern from that end, I realized you can communicate with these people because they are concerned parents, they are concerned sons and daughters, they've got parents with cancers, and they've got children with autism or ADHD, just like so many of us do. And that as you reach out to them kind of as a friend in this dialogue, it does an amazing job of really disarming people and really opening that dialogue so that we can create this change that we want to see. One of the things I do have on this list, and I hesitated to put it on, was because when people first suggested that I reach out to congressmen, I just thought, I'm not that mom. I was uncomfortable, and I wasn't sure that was really what I could do. But at the same time, I realized that as much as we can change our shopping habits in the grocery store, what is really required here is a national dialogue of all of us around our national dinner table. And so I thought, just as we're trying to teach each other, we can have members of Congress teaching each other too. And as I met with senators and I met with congressmen, I realized, they had children, grown children, that were suffering from all kinds of conditions. They had grandchildren that were suffering from peanut allergy, diabetes, ADHD, and that once again, they were just like us. And so it was in connecting at that really basic level as family that I realized that we really could educate each other and we could create this incredible change. And so as we began to navigate these things through the kitchen, one of the steps we took to try to reduce our grocery bills a little bit was to plant something. And again, growing up in Houston, Texas, where pretty much we were clueless when it came to growing anything, I literally had to take myself back to that lima bean plant that my kids were planting in the classrooms in a cup and say, okay, this is 101. We can do this. We can start here. And so we started there with tomatoes in a pot on the deck. And again, it was so inspiring. It just was encouraging to know that we actually can do so much more than we ever thought we were capable of. One of the other things that I really encourage moms to do is to really engage your community, and whether it's through your school community, whether it's through your neighborhood, whether it's through some alumni group that you're a part of, to start a blog, because in working with these large corporations, they are counting these blogs. They are well aware that moms are creating extraordinary change right now, that we're driving incredible change in the way that we care for the health of our children. We are integrating diet and nutrition, and they count the blogs. They count what you do. And in order to have your voice heard, to simply begin a blog, there's so many great systems you can embrace to really start this, or to get on Twitter, to begin talking about this, create the dialogue, because you really matter and you really are counted when it comes to how this is impacting the health of our children. Thankfully, again, using the internet, and I know as a busy mother of 4, when I was at home with these kids when they were really, really little, the internet was just this portal out onto the world, and it was like a window that I could go through to really get the information that I needed. Thankfully, we've got incredible TED Talks. There's a great one from an 11-year-old kid in North Carolina. There are all kinds of talks that have been presented by scientists, by food scientists, by people addressing the ethical implications of the way that we grow and feed our country and our animals here in the U.S. And again, none of this, you don't have to do everything, but you can do one thing. And we've got so many different resources online. Stonyfield has a lot of incredible resources. Kiwi has incredible resources. And again, we're recognizing that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. But what we're hoping to offer is a toolbox of all of these different resources and all of these different solutions, so that together we can find and create the changes that we want to see in the health of our families. And so again, I really urge all of you to simply do one thing. Whether you want to start in that dairy case and simply buy organic milk or organic yogurt, given that those are some of the key foods that we feed our little ones, or if you want to start by cutting out those fake colors, because yellow number 5 and all of these artificial reds and blues aren't used in kids' foods in other countries, just pick one thing and do one thing. High fructose corn syrup, since it's not used in sodas in other countries, maybe you want to start there and just try to kick high fructose corn syrup out of your family's diet. Whatever it is, you can simply do one thing, and you have the flexibility and the grace to go at it at your own speed and at your own pace, in a way that you're comfortable with, in a way that your parents are comfortable with, because a lot of times the grandparents aren't exactly open to a lot of these changes. And if you can do it in these incremental steps, sometimes it feels a lot less threatening to those that you love. And so then you can start to make these changes, to take these baby steps, always remembering not to make the perfect the enemy of the good, and always remembering to find a friend to have at your side, so that together you guys can create the changes that you want to see in the health of your family. So with that, we've got a few resources on this last page, but I really wanted to leave a lot of time open for questions, because I think the information and the insight that all of you have on the front lines of this new landscape of childhood is so valuable. So I want to take the opportunity to really open it up to all of you.
Thank you, Robin. It was all so eye-opening and inspirational, and we're getting so many great questions coming in from the audience. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm looking forward to hearing even more. But we'll start with, we had a couple of people, Robin, asking about when they go to the farmer's market, they often hear, well, for instance, one person said, I went to the farmer's market this past weekend, and no one was selling organic, but one farm told me that they do not spray. Is this okay? And what other questions can she ask to ensure that it's safe? And someone else asked, should we trust them when they say that? What's your thinking on that?
That's a really great question, because as we talked about with that USDA organic symbol, there are, unfortunately, a lot of fees associated with the use of that symbol. And so a lot of farmers are saying, I'm going to produce everything this way, organically, without that huge long list. Let me get back to that list. If we can produce everything organically without all of these different toxic ingredients, then I'm going to do that. And let me find it for you guys. And so if we can produce things without these ingredients, then we're going to do it. And if you want to ask for this list, these are the chemical food additives, toxic persistent pesticides, chemical fertilizers, high fructose corn syrup. If you want to ask your farmers if their food is produced without those things and they are willing to stand by that promise, then we can, that way we can know more about what they're putting onto their crops. But again, you really have to ask the questions. You have to know what you were talking about. You may want to go with a list of your concerns, whether it's these pesticides, these growth hormones, these genetically engineered ingredients, and ask the farmer. And if you want, to try to get a tour of their farm, get any information, go onto their website, because unfortunately, in the system that we have today, and especially the growing success of farmers markets, the integrity may not always be there. And so the only sure way to ensure that is through that USDA organic seal. But there are farmers that do adhere to that level. They just simply have chosen not to opt into that pricing structure.
Right, and it is, in a way, such a great opportunity to be able to talk to someone directly. So if people have the opportunity, what a chance to see, gauge for yourself. What do you think?
Right.
About their answers to your questions. Now that we have the questions to ask, thanks to your slide there. Sounds good. Robin, a lot of people are also asking about high fructose corn syrup. That some brands are starting to promote it as good for you, or at least not bad for you, that it's as natural as, as anything. And can you talk a little bit more about the concerns you have with it, and also how it's different on a label than corn syrup, if it is different? Those are some questions that have come up.
Those are great questions. And, again, I hadn't thought twice about high fructose corn syrup being in my kids' products, 6 years ago. I really just thought if it was on grocery store shelves, it was fine and it was safe. But then when I learned that children's products in other countries, and not even just children, a lot of products in other countries for adults as well, don't include high fructose corn syrup, I really had to kind of dial back and say, well, why are we using this here? And it was introduced in the 1960s, but it was widely adopted in the early 1980s by our soda companies because it was a cheap alternative to sugar. Sugar grown naturally had this incredible sweetening capacity, but when scientists in the lab discovered high fructose corn syrup, they realized it had this incredible, powerful sweetening capacity too. But beyond that, what they realized that high fructose corn syrup did more than sugar was that it also preserved the shelf life of those products. So the reason that we see it in things like ketchups and breads and hot dog buns is because it acts as a preservative and it helps enhance the shelf life of that product. So if something were using sugar instead, that product would go bad quickly, which for the food companies would mean they would have to send trucks out and people out, a new product, and restock it on the grocery store shelves. And obviously there's a lot of cost associated with that. By switching to high fructose corn syrup here in the U.S., they were able to avoid a lot of those costs because of the capacity that that ingredient has to serve as a preservative. And so, again, countries around the world, they've opted out of it because of this preservative capacity, and they would simply rather use a sweetener that's been around for a whole lot longer, since the 1960s, and use sugar. And so for us, it's definitely one of the ingredients that we try to avoid, not only now because of the chemical properties that allow it to act as a preservative, but also now because, as I mentioned earlier, with the introduction of this new genetically modified corn and all of the agrochemicals that that corn now contains that result in it being regulated by the EPA as an insecticide, there's no labeling on those corn crops. And so when all of that corn gets put into these giant grain elevators and blended together, there's no way of knowing if the genetically modified corn is mixed with the corn that wasn't genetically modified. And then as that corn is fed to livestock, which is what it's primarily used for in the U.S., it's also used in ethanol production. And when the remains of that ethanol production are repurposed back into the food supply as livestock feed, again, there's just simply no way of knowing. There's no accountability. We don't have that same audit trail like you do with the USDA organic symbol. And so there's simply no way of knowing where that corn has come from that's being used for the high fructose corn syrup. And, you know, as a concerned mother, I simply want to opt out of that experiment. And despite the fact that the Corn Refiners Association has done an amazing job of putting these advertisements up on TV, you know, saying that it's natural, obviously it's in their best interest financially to promote that message. The fact that high fructose corn syrup isn't used in children's products in a lot of developed countries, for us, it was just simply one of those things that we wanted to opt out of.
So to answer someone else's question that just popped up, the way you've described, you know, what it is, that means there could be no such thing as organic high fructose corn syrup. Is that right? Or is that a theoretical possibility?
You know, I mean, a lot of people will argue that in the process of making high fructose corn syrup, the chemical process introduces a lot of things that probably would not be approved under the organic production legal standards. But I'm not, you know, I'm not sure if that has been attempted or tried, so I can't.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I would say, you know, organic cane sugar is what is used in place of high fructose corn syrup, and it's simply it's sugar the way we've had sugar for thousands of years,
right?
As opposed to this chemically derived sweetener from corn.
Right. We've also had a lot of questions about milk coming in. Somebody asked that she had thought that soy milk was a better alternative than cow's milk, but now maybe there's some concern about soy. I wonder if you could talk about. But then we've also had a couple of people asking about the milk that they buy is labeled growth hormone free, and is that good enough? Is that as good as organic? What you know, what are they looking for on that front?
These are such great questions. These are because these were the ones that when I first was learning all of this, and you know, truly I had a night where I was putting my baby to bed, and I just was sitting in the rocking chair holding her thinking, oh my gosh, how many sippy cups have I filled with this milk? And the soy, you know, how much of this soy did I eat when I was pregnant? How much of it did I feed my children, not knowing that it contained all these agrochemical ingredients and this new biotechnology that was introduced as recently as in the last 15 years. And so as I really was kind of lifting the veil on all of that and trying to learn about the milk supply and learn how children are fed in other countries, with this precautionary approach taken, I learned that really, you know, the issue around soy, it can kind of be this double-edged sword, where in some cases it, you know, absolutely has health advantages, especially those that are challenged in different ways. But in other cases, you know, it can introduce a risk, especially when you're considering the fact that it contains these agrochemical ingredients. And so as I really stepped back from that, I thought, you know, again, this is how do we manage this in the real world in moderation? And I realized that when our children have soy, what I was more concerned about the agrochemical ingredients than I was about the soy, and to make sure that we were feeding the children organic soy rather than the soy that had been engineered to withstand increasing doses of this toxic weed killer. That was absolutely something that I was going to invest in when it came to the grocery store. And so we definitely moved towards organic soy in all cases because, you know, while the jury may still be out on soy and you know, there's a lot of science supporting both sides, to me the agrochemicals were of the greatest concern. And so that was where I decided to invest with the organic soy. The question about milk, the difference between milk that is labeled RBGH-free and milk that is labeled organic is a great question, because what I learned initially was we knew that we wanted to opt out of this RBGH, this synthetic growth hormone that's pumped into these cows to help them make more milk. It also resulted in all of these diseases and increased antibiotic use. And that RBGH, that synthetic growth hormone, was never allowed in Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and all 27 countries in Europe. And so that was the very first thing that I wanted to get rid of. And as I stood in that dairy case, that question was, well, what's the difference? Why is one RBGH free and why is one organic? And what I learned is that the milk that's labeled RBGH free promises not to use that artificial growth hormone, but then the organic milk takes it a step further. And the organic milk says that not only are we not going to inject our cows with this artificial growth hormone, but we're also not going to be injecting them and feeding them all of these antibiotics. And then on top of that, what's going into those cows, the things that's being fed to cows, is equally as important. As any mom knows who's ever had a baby and nursed a baby, what you eat is really important in the quality of your milk, and the same goes for those cows. And so the organic milk, those cows are fed food that is not genetically modified, does not contain these insecticidal proteins, and therefore the milk quality has higher levels of all kinds of great nutrients and vitamins and minerals and the benefits that you would see from the livestock being fed a healthier diet. And so that's the promise of the organic milk. That's why that product is slightly more expensive when it comes to its purchase in the grocery store. But if you really consider the fact that you are investing in the health of your family, which is something that, it was an analysis that I did. I simply stepped back and I thought, okay, if we're going to spend more at the grocery store, are we spending less at the pediatrician's office? And when I learned that 70% of a child's immune system is found in their digestive tract, and that we could get these synthetic ingredients and these artificial colors and these chemicals out of their digestive tract and out of those pipes, that it would allow a chance for that immune system to heal. And so as we really migrated our way onto this cleaner eating, reducing our family's exposure to the synthetic pesticides and chemicals and artificial colors and growth hormones, I tracked for my husband the complete decline we saw in the pediatric bills, and the fact that as a mom I wasn't shuttling back and forth all the time between the pediatrician's office and the drugstore buying antibiotics for ear infections and eczema creams and all kinds of different prescriptions for these kids. And I realized that you could either pay for health in the grocery store or you could pay for disease in the doctor's office. And as we began to make that shift, we began to invest in health.
I have a couple more questions coming in about milk, so if we'll just stay on this for a minute, Robin. Do you have an opinion on raw milk?
The raw milk, I think there needs to be further investigation there. Mm-hmm. I think it's a relatively new issue that's presenting itself, and sadly, what we've seen with organics is that when the conventional industry has a vested interest in a product, their marketing and their R&D and their incredible financial strength is going to go into promoting studies that promote their product. And yet at the same time, when you do conduct these different independent studies and they do show the incredible advantages of organic food, I think when it comes to an issue that is as contentious as raw milk, it really begs the need for further studies.
Right. In talking about organic, what about, someone asked a question about, she's seen the USDA organic symbol, but also seen items with a label. She says it looks similar, but says that the product is only partially organic. So is that something to watch out for, or is that a good thing? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because there are a lot of loopholes and people are going to want to exploit it anyway. If you go to allergykidsfoundation.org, I've got a great page up that is Organics 101, and it really walks you through what all of these different things mean for different categories. So, what does organic meat mean? What does organic dairy mean? Where are you, going to get the best bang for your buck health-wise? Where does it make the most sense to purchase organic? And the different standards by the USDA organic. And so to carry that seal, that's adhering to the highest quality standard. But then companies that can't meet that incredibly high bar and speak to the integrity of that product will then say, we do a pretty good job. We've got 70% organic. And if you flip it over and you want to see if the agrochemical ingredients in corn and soy are of concern to you as they are to our family, then, I always flip it over and I think, have they covered corn and soy? Those are organic ingredients, are those covered? And again, you have the incredible ability to make these informed choices as an informed consumer. And I think, if you have products that are promising to be 70% organic and you go to the ingredient list and it's the ingredients that matter, if it's milk or corn or soy, if those are the ingredients that matter to you, then, as an informed consumer, you can make that choice.
That's great advice. Do you have, someone mentioned that you talked about starting a book club and talking about things with your friends, and I know some of our readers belong to Moms Meet and they meet with their groups. Can you recommend some books that that made a difference to you that you would recommend to book clubs?
Yeah, there are some incredible books. The Medical Board of the Allergy Kids Foundation is an extraordinary group, and when I was choosing these doctors, I was really mindful of financial ties that a lot of doctors do now have with industry. And as I highlight in my book, I mean, there's technically nothing wrong with that. I think there needs to be full transparency and full disclosure so that, if you're taking the advice of a doctor, they've got a financial tie to a food or a drug company. And so when I was choosing the advisors for the Allergy Kids Foundation, the doctors that I think are doing an extraordinary job are Joel Fuhrman, and he has written books called Disease Proof Your Child. He's authored a number of books. He's a dad of 4. His heart is absolutely tied to this, and the research that he has done that shows the important role that diet and nutrition can play in really restoring and strengthening the health of kids is so inspiring. Another great book is by Dr. Kenneth Bach. He's also a Random House author, and he wrote the book Healing the New Childhood Epidemics, Allergies, Autism, ADHD, and Asthma. He is an incredible friend. He wrote the foreword to my book, and his book really takes you through how the chemicals in our environment and in our food supply impact this immune system that's in the digestive tract of the child. And his work has really been focused on how do you detox these kids. I mean, how do you really clean them out? And so his work, he's done a lot of work with autistic children, and he's a powerful voice for change in this space. And then, there are a lot of other books. There are the resources that's listed on Allergy Kids Foundation org. Again, there are just so many different people that are coming at this from so many different ways. There are a lot of great cookbooks. Mariel Hemingway has written some great cookbooks, that really help you learn how to begin to integrate these changes into your family's kitchen. And again, it's always remembering that it's about baby steps and not making the perfect the enemy of the good. Another one of our advisors is Dr. Bob Sears, and if you go to askdrsears.com, they've got great resources. The question that came up earlier about the soy, Dr. Sears Sr., the dad who's written, I think, 8 or 9 books, he was one of the first to really sound the alarm when a lot of these genetically engineered soybeans were being introduced in the U.S. And they've got some incredible resources on their site as well.
And Robin, one of our readers suggested a book that I would like to second, which is your book, The Unhealthy Truth. So thanks to the listener who wanted, just to remind everyone on the call, if you haven't read Robin's book yet, that it's a great, great eye-opening book and great thing to discuss with your friends too. So I'll just add that, Robin.
Well, thank you.
I want to go to a question. And actually, speaking of your book, I want to let everybody know that, as I think you all know, we're giving away copies of Robin's book to 10 people who attend the webinar. And so those of you who are selected afterwards to get the book, you'll hear, or the people who are selected to get the Stonyfield coupons, you will hear by email in the next couple of days. So I just want to get that announcement out there so everyone knows. But before we're just getting close to the end of our time, but I want to ask you, Robin, a question from one of our audience members about dealing with this sort of thing in your day-to-day life with your kids, because we're learning so much about these ingredients. But she says that they're vegetarian parents raising their kids that way and has a good handle on this. And I think this is probably going to resonate with a lot of people. But because there's TV and friends, and their kids still ask for Cocoa Pebbles and fruit snacks. And how do you balance all of that without taking away the fun. You know, kids being kids and not feel excluded and not feel like you're saying no all the time. What do you do, Robin?
This is a great question, and it's something that I was really sensitive to navigating, because as I really kind of looked at the concern that I had around the health of the children and the chemicals in the food supply, I was also incredibly mindful of research that was showing that 1 in 4 college girls admits to having an eating disorder. And so the last thing anybody would want to do would be to impose that kind of condition on a child inadvertently. And so I thought, how do we inspire the kids so that they can make these choices themselves? And so what we began to do was that, we offered them the choice. We said, you can choose to have that blue cupcake. The chances are it's probably going to make your tummy hurt, and it's probably going to make your head hurt, and you're probably going to pick a fight with your brother, and you're going to end up in timeout. And so if you choose that, that's fine. You're choosing all those consequences. And so for a while, of course, the kids did. They chose the blue cupcake until, like when you potty train a kid or when you wean them from a sippy cup, those changes do not happen overnight. And the same goes here. You teach them over and over and over again until they get to the point that day where when they see that blue cupcake, they know that it's going to trigger the stomach ache, and it's going to trigger the headache, and they're going to feel bad, and they're going to pick a fight and end up in timeout. And our kids truly got to that point. And so, it was recognizing they've got these brilliant brains in their heads, and that, like all of us, nobody wants to feel bad. And if you can teach them that, you can choose this now, but the consequences later are going to be, that you're going to feel bad and end up in trouble, it allows them to make that choice themselves. And then you've got your own little empowered consumer. And it takes this kind of control issue and this battle out of the way that could lead to conditions like eating disorders later in life. And so I think, again, that's where for us this 80-20 rule is incredibly important, was to sort of, for some people to start at maybe 50-50, whatever's comfortable for you, pick that split so that you have the grace and you have the flexibility to operate in the real world. And, as you really educate your kids, saying, moms learn this thing, the kids in other countries aren't exposed to a lot of these chemicals because of all of these concerns. Just teach your children, have a very honest and open dialogue about why you're making these choices as a family, and model it. Because if they see you, they know mom's taking care of herself too, and she's taking care of us. That is so wrapped up in love, and that is truly one of the best gifts that you can give your family.
That's a great message, Robin. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're running out of time. I want to let everybody know that this webinar presentation with Robin will be available later on today at kiwimagonline.com/college. So anyone who missed a part of it can hear the rest. And I know a couple people have asked they want to send it along to grandparents and other friends. So you'll be able to do that later today. Please check out kiwimagonline.com/college to hear this again. And so, Robin, I think we are out of time, but I really can't thank you enough for all of this great information and your inspirational message. I think we're all going to go away from this ready to make the changes that make sense for our families.
Well, and I would love to invite everyone to reach out. We love sharing the stories on Allergy Kids website. Some of the most incredibly inspiring stories come straight from the parents and the caregivers that are on the front lines with these kids. The changes that you guys are creating at home, the blogs that you're starting, the juice companies, the food companies, the gluten-free companies. People are just doing such incredible things. And so please stay in touch at allergykidsfoundation.org.
Great. I think people will. And Robin, I just want you to let you know we're getting just a lot of messages coming in from everyone thanking you too. So thanks everyone for you being here, and thanks for showing your support for Robin and for Kiwi. So thank you everyone. Thanks to Stonyfield, our sponsor, for making this possible today. And have a wonderful rest of your day.